We were in this Canto 3, the Yoga of the King, Book 1. And if I'm not wrong, we had gone up to the line, and paying here God's debt to earth and man, a greater sonship was his divine right. If you recollect, we are discussing the nature, the personality of Ashwapati. Canto 3, Book 1. That is Yoga of the King, Book 1.
Yoga of the King.
The front page only, just 15 lines below. I just did the line, and paying here God's debt to earth and man. Maybe 15 lines on the top. And paying here God's debt to man. You see, all these lines which give us a sketch of the personality of Ashwapati are in a way an explanation or an expansion of the very first line, which says, a world's desire compelled her mortal birth. Pardon?
Who is her?
Her is Savitri. Savitri. You see, so we discussed that who is this person who is compelling? Does he have the sufficient consciousness to compel an avatar to come down? You see, if we pray, we cannot compel. We can only pray, invoke, request. But here is a person who is able to compel the Divine Mother to come down as Savitri. So we are getting immediately a kind of a sketch, a kind of a flashback to see who is this Ashwapati who has this much power that he can even compel the Divine Mother to come down. So we see it in that manner. So we are getting all these things. Is a protagonist, a colonist, his birth is held up. All these lines are a sketch of his personality. So we can see here a person who is universal in his consciousness, who has the power of the universal consciousness. So it is in that light we are seeing the first 15 lines, and then I'll continue, if not 15, till the line as I said. A greater sonship was his divine right. You see, he was not just a human son or a human father or a human king. His origin was something different. What was it? We said here he was a colonist from immortality. And then he goes on to say, although consenting to mortal ignorance, his knowledge shared the light ineffable. A perfect description of an avatar. You see, the avatar has the light ineffable, L capital, but he consents, he agrees, he says, all right, I will share my light with the mortal ignorance. He'll participate. That's exactly the role of the avatar. Keeping his light supreme, he comes down to share it with ignorance. A strength of the original permanence. You see, every word, every sentence there tells us about his greatness. And here you see a strength of the original permanence, P capital. Permanent and the impermanent. The philosophical concept The permanent is the absolute, the Brahman, the Supreme. So he is the strength of that original permanence and entangled in the moment and its flow. You see the beautiful description, how he has consented to come down, bringing down his power, and he says, entangled in the moment and its flow. You must also appreciate this, each word is not a description, it is not a narrative. This is the word entangled. It's exactly reflecting our own stature. Human beings also, we have this soul, the psychic being, but we are all entangled in the life's flow, its problems, its vital problems, its mental. This is the word entangled. It's difficult to come out of it. He kept the vision of the vast behind. You see, that's the difference between man and the avatar. We get entangled and we forget our origin. But here is the avatar who is entangled in the moment, and yet he keeps the vision of the vast. That means he has the memory, the consciousness of his origin. That's the basic difference between man and the avatar. A power was in him from the unknowable, an archivist of the symbols of the beyond, a treasurer of the superhuman dreams. He bore the stamp of mighty memories and shed their grandiose ray on human life. See, as I said many a time, and I will not be tired to tell you again and again, that I always see him. Whenever I'm reading these lines, the face in front of me is Sri Aurobindo. You see exactly all these things. A power was in him from the unknowable, an archivist of the symbols of the beyond. And archives. What is archives? This is something of the past, something that has already gone in the past tense. Which you don't want to throw away, right? Thank you. You want to keep it. Keep it as a treasure, something memorable. So here was an archivist of the symbols of the beyond, B capital. So you see, this archivist, at least for me, there's nobody else than Sri Aurobindo, who has gained, revisited, re-experienced all the spiritual experiences of the past. So you see, that's one of the reasons why we can understand why Sri Aurobindo had to experience the nirvana, the silence of the mind, the Brahman consciousness, the consciousness in the idol, every spiritual aspect, be it the God within, the God outer, the God impermanent, every aspect of spirituality he realized. Why? Because he was the archivist. In him, all these experiences were there, hidden. What he had to do was only to bring it out. As an archivist says, I will bring out from this folder, from this room, that experience. So here was Sri Aurobindo bringing out all those archival symbols. A treasurer of his superhuman dreams, he bore the stamp of mighty memories. What were you doing? Sri Aurobindo was asked in your previous births. He says, I was helping evolution. That means he is carrying within him all the superhuman dreams of man. What man dreamt as an archivist, as an artist, as a scientist, as a businessman, all these dreams of man he had within him. So now what is he doing? He bore the stamp of mighty memories and shed their grandiose ray on human life. All these great ideals. For Sri Aurobindo presence as a poet now, as a social philosopher, as an educationist, all these great memories, great experiences, now he's sharing with all of us. His days were a long growth to the Supreme. That is the quintessence of yoga. You see, his days were a long growth to the Supreme. His days, every day, was a march toward the Supreme. Who can say that? I mean, is our day a march towards the Supreme? But here is a yogi, Ashrapati. Call him Sri Aurobindo, call him Ashrapati. But every day there is a progress. So, and you should see the word, his days were a long growth. It's not a static thing. It's not that he stayed there for 6 months without growth. Every day was a growth towards the Supreme. A skyward being nourishing its roots on sustenance from occult spiritual founts, climbed through white rays to meet an unseen sun. S capital. It's purely Sri Aurobindo who climbed every day towards that supramental sun. If time permits, I brought something else to share with you today, where we'll see Sri Aurobindo says, I am climbing towards that supramental sun. I mean, in his own words, I'll bring it out today, where he says, I have climbed through white rays to meet an unseen sun, the supramental sun. His soul lived as eternity's delegate. His mind was like a fire assailing heaven. His will a hunter in the trails of light. I mean, you don't have to understand that. You see the rhythm. His soul lived as eternity's delegate. You see, each part of him, the soul is an eternity's delegate. We are all the same. But he is conscious. And then his mind was like a fire assailing heaven. You see the word assailing. You know your English well. You see what a strong word it is. It is attacking, storming, going with a tremendous power. So his mind was like a fire assailing heaven. I mean, he's attacking. His mind is not really lost in his lower world. It's constantly moving towards that heaven. And with a tremendous force, attacking, storming. And his will, a hunter in the trails of light. You see the word hunting. I mean, every one of them you should understand how the poet is using each part of his being at its highest, intensest, deepest. He's a hunter. It is a fire assailing. It's an eternity's delegate. And the most beautiful line, each action left the footprints of a god. Each moment was a beat of puissant wings. Marvelous. I think somewhere else we see this. I tried to look in my volume 5, but I do remember there was this. Each action left the footprints of a god. Yeah. In fact, now I remember where it is. It is in Monada's book, The Supreme. Are you able to hear me at the back, Toby? Is it clear enough? Because we don't have a mic today. You see how each footprint, how each action was like a footprint of a god. Like a footprint of a god stays on permanently. It is there forever. In India, of course, I do not know the custom in the West, but in India, in many a temple you will see the footprint of a god. They etched it out on a stone. So people go and do a pranam there. They said this is where the yogi was there. This is where even Sri Aurobindo's feet and mother's feet you must have seen. There's a footprint. I don't know if you have seen that ever. There's an exhibition of Sri Aurobindo's photographs, it seems. I got this directly from Champaklalji. When he wanted to take the footprint of Sri Aurobindo, to take a footprint of the mother was easy. You ask her, please mother, stand on this sheet of paper. She would stand there, you can draw it out. But a footprint of Sri Aurobindo, it was impossible, or next to impossible. Because you could not have commanded or requested or ordered Sri Aurobindo to do that. He was there on the bed in his own world. And yet Champaklal says, I will take the footprint of Sri Aurobindo. And I remember still Champaklalji narrating this to me, and then he goes out, brings out from the cupboard the footprint of Sri Aurobindo. What did he do? Sri Aurobindo was lying in his bed, and when he got up to go to the bathroom, he put a paper under there, just below where he normally would put his feet. But the moment Sri Aurobindo got up and put his foot here, immediately he was waiting with the pencil, he drew one foot. But Sri Aurobindo cannot be saying, I'll wait, draw the other one. So he just got up, took his next step, went to the bathroom. Fine. So for the day, he got 1 foot. Maybe the right one. And then he waited for the next day, when Sri Aurobindo would again go to the bathroom. So next day when Sri Aurobindo put his feet again, he drew the left one. So you see Sri Aurobindo's feet peculiarly, one foot is like that, the other one is like this. It's not two are not together. Because he's just sat like, you can see my feet like that, you are sitting like that comfortably, you are not sitting like that 2 feet together. So he had one foot like that, the left one relaxed. So in the footprints of Sri Aurobindo you will see one like that and the other one. And he drew both of them, and then he sent it to the mother, and mother blessed it. So those are the footprints that are there now forever for all of us to see. And so was the, and that day I still remember Deepshika was with me and we were sitting in his room and he brought out these footprints of God. That was a moment I'll never forget. It's still vibrant in my being. When for the first time I saw the Lord's footprints, we did the pranam. So here was Ashwapati. Each action. So you see, each moment, each action left a footprint for man to adore. And the mother also says the same thing. That she says, wherever she walked upon this earth, she awoke the supramental in matter, the supramental in the very cells, the atomic cells. So for her, walking was not a pleasure walk, is not a question of morning walk. She stepped, be it in Paris, be it in Algeria, be it in Japan, be it in Pondicherry, be it anywhere. So she says, I consciously walk the earth because her each footprint, each step awoke the supermind in matter's cells, matter's atoms. So she says, I want to walk. So even when we are not very well, so-called well, she used to ask Pranabda, let me walk in my own room. People thought it is a walk for her limbs, for her legs. It is not a walk like that. For her, touching with her feet the earth was to awaken the superman in matter. So that is the importance of the footprint. It's not just a poetical image that is there for a beautiful footprint. It is meaningful, it's symbolic, it is eventful actually. So he says, each action left the footprints of a god. Each moment was a beat of puissant wings. You see, this is the meaning of the avatar. Why do we go and do our pranam at his foot, on the feet? Because this, in India, we have this celebration that whenever we see our Guru, a spiritual master, we bow down at his feet. Because they leave the footprint of the consciousness on our body, on our mind, on our soul. So we don't go and shake hands with the Guru. We first do the pranam at his feet. So that's the importance of the feet in Indian culture. So here we see that. And then each moment was a beat of puissant wings. You know, the avatar, the moment we see him, the moment we contact him, every moment, awakens in us a puissant wings of aspiration. So that is not the value is a small word. That is the importance, the significance of why we want to hear the mother's voice, why we want to read Savitri, why we want to do this. Because reading Savitri, reading the mother is not reading, it is reconnecting. And the moment we connect, something happens. The puissant wings of aspiration awaken. So there, till this line, we had the beautiful sketch of Ashwapati. So if you want to know who is Ashwapati, I would say if you want to know who is Sri Aurobindo, you quote these lines. Perfectly is about himself. From that line onwards, we take a different description. Now we see the description of the journey, the growth of Ashwapati in his sadhana. You see, it's a very clear demarcation. From there we enter immediately the pursuit of the soul. What we have seen in the Yoga of the King, he realizes his soul, and from here we begin to get the description of what is soul, what a soul is, what is the psychic being, how did Ashwapati go about it. And if Sri Aurobindo, as the mother tells us, that this book, Savitri, is that intense, a whole description of yoga, the steps towards your own yoga, here are the steps. First, the little plot of our mortality, touched by this tenant from the heights, became a playground of the living infinite. You see the concept of the tenant. Who is this tenant? The soul, the Atman. Because it is the Atman which comes into this body, which takes up a body. So he is here as a tenant. And he is not yet the master. He is not yet the owner. He is there, although as if requesting the body, can I be here for 60 years, 80 years, 90 years? There's a contract of a tenant. But that's what is the normal life. The soul remains the tenant. But the yoga makes it the owner of this house called the body. So now he's describing the little plot of our mortality, the body, the mind, the vital, touched by this tenant from the heights, became a playground of the living infinite. I mean, for me, I cannot move on, Every word arrests me here. A playground of the living infinite. So what's a playground? At least I know for me there's only one playground in the world, the ashram playground. Because there I've seen the living infinite moving on, moving around. For me, the mother, the living infinite, moved in that playground, touched that playground, walked that playground. And therefore, this body, because of this tenant called the soul, it can become, is not yet, could become the playground of the living infinite if the soul becomes the master. As a tenant, it has no right. It cannot compel. This body is not a playground of this living infinite. But it could become, touched by this tenant from the heights, became a playground of the living infinite. These are very famous lines. You must have heard this before. This bodily appearance is not all. The form deceives. The person is a mask. Hid deep in man, celestial powers can dwell. I almost visualize Sri Aurobindo taking up a new brush, new color, and then it says, the bodily appearance is not all. You see, each of these lines, previous line was a different color. The little plot of mortality, one color. Then suddenly brings out a new idea. This bodily appearance is not all. The form deceives. The person is a mask. You see the word personality, the persona, your Greek origin. The persona is this external mask. There's something real. The real person is within. So the form deceives. The person is a mask. hid deep in man's celestial powers can dwell. His fragile ship conveys through the sea of years an incognito of the imperishable. What is this fragile ship? The human body. This human body conveys to the sea of years. We live 60 years, 80 years, 90 years. It conveys, it transports. What does it transport? An incognito of the imperishable. The incognito is the soul. It is taking the soul, is transporting. But still the incognito, because we don't know our soul. Without knowing, we are transporting the soul from experience to experience through the years. And there it says, again, a spirit that is the flame of God abides, a fiery portion of the wonderful, artist of his own beauty and delight, immortal in our mortal poverty. You see, a spirit that is a flame of God abides. Well, we all know the word flame of God. It refers to the psychic being. A spirit that is a flame of God abides in this body. But have you ever asked the question, why is it called the flame? The psychic being, we all say, is the flame. Yes, most of us would say, well, in India we call this the soul as the Agni, the fire, the flame. So, psychic being is called the flame of God. But it's not just Agni, it's not just flame. What is the essential nature and characteristic of the psychic being? Love. So it is not the flame, it is the love of God that abides within us. The connection between the flame and love, the Mother herself explains. All this question of flame and fire is an external symbol. Even the sun is only an external metaphor of a symbol of the divine love. So wherever there is flame, the source, the origin of this flame is love. So then I understood why the psychic being is called a flame of God. Because the psychic being is the substance of love. Therefore we call that the flame is this love, a fiery portion of the wonderful. You see, a fiery portion, fiery here, again we see the word fire, but here is fiery, the adjective, the impetuosity, the ardent impetuosity. And in the Rig Veda it seems this soul is called the Adbhuta, the wonderful. Adbhuta. So we have here the wonderful. So this psychic being is an impetuous and ardent portion of the wonderful W capital. That wonderful is the supreme, the Adbhuta, the great wonder. So now we see again a beautiful, we have all heard of the psychic being, but never have we read such beautiful descriptions. Each one of us, each color, each sketch, each time he gives it a little brush with a different character. So we see, artist of his own beauty and delight, immortal in our mortal poverty. Who is immortal in our poverty? The psychic being.
I have a question. First time here, it says here, our mortal poverty. So this means we are in this mortal poverty. And how come Savitri is not? Is it some kind of immaculate birth? Or how comes this difference into the year? That our mortal poverty seems to be a general fate or a condition that is kind of the doom of knows on every verse, or every mass, and this life, that is being different.
Yeah, you see, I think what you need to understand here, we are not discussing about Savitri herself. Here is a general description of the human birth, of the birth of the psychic in our mortality. So, it is not about Savitri, it is not the birth of Ashwapati. It is the birth of the common man. So is our mortal poverty, but in this mortal poverty, poverty is not the material poverty or the physical level. Poverty of nature, poverty of our incapacity, poverty of our limitations. So this is the poverty of the mind, the vital and the physical. So into this limitations, into this poverty of the human being, there is something called the immortal, the soul. And here I have a poem here, which is a beautiful poem called Is This the End? In volume 5, page 108. There's exactly the same phrase here, so I picked it up to share with you. The poem is called Is This the End? So we remember that. Is this the end of all that we have been and all we did or dreamed? A name unremembered and a form undone? Is this the end? A body rotting under a slab of stone or turned to ash and fire? A mind dissolved, lost its forgotten thoughts? Is this the end? Our little hours that were and are no more, our passions once so high, being mocked by the still earth and calm sunshine, is this the end? Our yearnings for the human Godward climb, passing to other hearts deceived, while smiles towards death and hell the world, is this the end? Fallen is the harp, shattered it lies and mute. Is the unseen player dead? Because the trees felled where the birds sang, must the song too hush? One in the mind who planned and willed and thought, worked to reshape earth's fate. One in the heart who loved and yearned and hoped, does he too end? The immortal in the mortal is his name. An artist Godhead here ever remolds himself in diviner shapes, unwilling to cease, till all is done for which the stars were made, till the heart discovers God and the soul knows itself. And even then, there's no end. Marvelous. The second portion is what is going to come again in Savitri. The second portion means from here, the immortal in the mortal is his name, an artist Godhead here, ever remolds himself in diviner shapes, unwilling to cease, till all is done for which the stars were made, till the heart discovers God and the soul knows itself. And even then, there's no end. A very touching, lovely thing. But you see, the essential Sri Aurobindo, who wrote the sonnet long many years back, and who writes the Savitri long many years later, but the essential experience is the same. That's why I share with you these sonnets, because I find the same experience. So here we see what we have read in the poem, we come to see here. It says, immortal in our mortal poverty, this sculptor of the forms of the infinite, this screened, unrecognized inhabitant, initiate of his own veiled mysteries, hides in a small dumb seed his cosmic thought. In the mute strength of the occult idea, determining predestined shape and act, passenger from life to life, from scale to scale, changing his image self from form to form, he regards the icon growing by his gaze, and in the worm foresees the coming of God, the coming God. I'll not go more on this. I'll stop here because I want to share with you something more. I see the time isn't much so. So let us say we have stopped at this sentence, immortal in our mortal poverty, because after that I'll take up again with reference to some other poems. But I'd like to share with you again what I've been talking about, Sri Aurobindo's yoga. Because we are searching in Savitri those passages which bring out integral yoga, the way it is done, the steps of the integral yoga. But here the other day I found a conversation between Sri Aurobindo and a great disciple whom all of you know, Dilip Kumar Roy. This is a book called The Pilgrim of the Stars. If you haven't read it, it's a must. Dilip Kumar Roy, Pilgrims of the Stars. It is not just about Sri Aurobindo. He talks about Raman Maharishi, Tagore, Krishna Prem. So it's an extraordinary book. But what's wonderful here is Sri Aurobindo and Dilip Kumar Roy in an interview. And it's interesting because not for the first time, and we see in those days, it was in 1924, January, the experience, And how clearly Sri Aurobindo mentions about his yoga and what he is doing in 24. When was the Siddhi day? Siddhi year was 26. So even before 1926, here is a conversation, and I'd like to read out in the given time, maybe I'll take 5-10 minutes more. It was in January, this is on page 116 of this book. It was in January 1924 that I saw Sri Aurobindo for the first time. For you. I enjoyed the rare privilege of having a long talk with him on the 24th. The next day, the duration of the talk was shorter. I kept an elaborate record of all that had passed, and this report I sent him subsequently for revision. He approved of it substantially and made only a few minor corrections. Here is the report. It was about 8 in the morning. Sri Aurobindo lived then in the house which stands at the main entrance to the ashram. He was seated in a chair on the front veranda. I bowed before him and took another chair in front. An oblong table between us. A radiant personality sang the very air about him. A deep aura of peace encircled him, an ineffable yet concrete peace that drew you almost at once into the magic orbit. But it was his eyes that fascinated me most, shining like beacons. His torso was bare, except for a scarf thrown across. What we see here. The greatest living yogi of India, my heart beat fast. Hitherto I had seen but a few sadhus and sannyasis, but here was a real yogi who lived thus for years in seclusion and yet took some interest in my doings. He appraised me with his soothing yet penetrative gaze. It would be impossible to adequately portray my reactions. After a time, with some effort, I pulled myself together. I have come, I stammered out. To know, to ascertain rather, if I can be initiated. I want to practice your yoga to start with, if possible. He answered simply, you must tell me first what it is exactly that you seek and why you want to do my yoga. I was lost. Why? Did I know myself? How then to put it all clearly and cogently? I strove hard to find some light in my bewilderment. Suppose, I found tongue at last. I suggested, rather suffer me to ask if you could help me in attaining, or shall we say discovering, the object of life. You must appreciate the frankness, and Aurobindo for the first time sees this gentleman called Dilip Kumar Roy, and you see the connection they have established already. So he says, shall I attain my object of life? Dilip Kumar Roy is asking. Aurobindo says, that's not an easy question to answer. He said, for I know of no one desideratum which is cherished equally by all, any more than I know of an object of life equally treasured by all. The object or aim of life cannot but vary with various people and seekers too approach yoga with diverse aims. Some want to practice yoga to get away from life, like the Mayavadi. They want to renounce life altogether, since this phenomenal life they contend is an illusion, Maya, which hides the ultimate reality. There are others who aspire after a supreme love or bliss, yet others who want from yoga power or knowledge or a tranquil poise impervious to the shocks of life. So you must first of all be definite as to what precisely you seek in yoga. I'm trying to imagine the whole thing, that Aurobindo sitting in 1924, and what clarity, what precision, and is explaining to Dilip the different objects of life. Which one do you want? You see, it brings to us when we read exactly what is it that we want. We have come to Aurobindo, we have come to ashram, we have come to the... Is it just we have come to? Do we have an object why we have come to? You see, it's such a awakening question. He says, you must be definite as to what precisely you seek in yoga: power, bliss, nirvana, maya. Dilip says, I want to know, I proffered desperately, if yoga could in the last resort lead to a solution of the anomalies of life with all its native sufferings and humiliations. Aurobindo, you mean transcendent knowledge? If you like, but then no. For I want bliss too, crowning this wisdom. You can certainly get either from yoga. May I then aspire to an initiation from you? Initiation. You see, Dilip Kumar was a great intellect and was very frank, and he has interviewed the best of the minds of his time. And also admired Dilip's, fearlessness. He was not really, afraid to speak to Aurobindo. What will he say? And so he says, may I then aspire to an initiation from you? Aurobindo, you may. May I then aspire? You may. Provided you agree to its conditions and your call is strong. I'm purposely reading it out because we have to be clear about ourselves. These are questions that we have to ask ourselves. If you agree to its conditions and your call is strong. Dilip, couldn't you give me an idea about the nature of these conditions and about this call you speak of? May I ask what you mean exactly? I gathered from your booklet Yogic Sadhana, I pursued before he could reply to my question, that you call yourself a tantric who believes in Leela and not a follower of Shankara believing in Maya. You have written, for instance, to fulfill God in life is man's manhood. He has done his homework well. All of us know this is from the Life Divine. And if my memory, and he's telling this to Sri Aurobindo on his face, and if my memory doesn't fail me, you said in your Life Divine, we must accept the many-sidedness of the manifestation even while we assert the unity of the manifested. Sri Aurobindo. It is true that I am a believer in Leela. He nodded. But what exactly do you refer to that? I'm sorry, why exactly do you refer to that? I wanted to make sure whether you really meant what you wrote in your yogic sadhana. Look at his guts, I tell you. I hope too that your yoga doesn't make it binding on one to live like a cave dweller who disowns the many-mooded active life, or shall we say like a passive pensioner whose day is done. This hope happily has been fostered by your repudiation of Mayavada. Sri Aurobindo, I see what you mean, he said, giving me an indulgent smile. Well, yes, I am not a Mayavadi. Happily for you, as well as for me. Mayavadi is one who believes in Maya, Shankara's theory.
The world is illusion and the happiness.
So he says, I am not a Mayavadi. Happily for you as well as for me. But incidentally, I am not the author of the book Yogic Sadhana. You see how beautifully he puts it. Incidentally, let's clear that I am not the author. How do you mean? Haven't you heard of automatic writing? Planchet? Planchet writing and reading? Not exactly. I merely held the pen while a disembodied being wrote off what he wished using my pen and hand. So Sri Aurobindo tried that. And the whole book is written by someone else using Sri Aurobindo's pen and hand. So he says, I'm not the author. May I ask why you lent yourself to such writing? Dilip is asking. Sri Aurobindo, at the time I was trying to find out how much of truth and how much of subliminal suggestions from the submerged consciousness there might be in phenomena of this kind. But let that pass. To return to your main question, you see what a wonderful dialogue they're having, I can't imagine Sri Aurobindo speaking like that. That's why I'm reading it out. One side you see Savitri and one side you see Life Divine and the other side you see Sri Aurobindo talking. To return to your main question, you asked about the active life. Well, it isn't binding on you to renounce all that you value in your active life. What you must be ready to renounce is attachment to everything on that plane, whether you live within or outside the wheel of karma. For if you keep these attachments, the light from above will not be able to work unhampered to effect the radical transformation of your nature. Does that imply that I must forego, say, all human sympathy and true friendship, all joy of life and fellow feeling? And Dilip was full of it. He was a great musician. He had great many friends, great many admirers. So imagine he is being asked to detach himself. So he is asking straight away, all human sympathy and true friendship, all joy of life and fellow feeling? Sure, but it doesn't. Absence of love and fellow feeling is not necessary to the divine nearness. On the contrary, a sense of closeness and oneness with others is a part of the divine consciousness into which the sadhak enters by nearness to the divine and feeling of oneness with the divine. An entire rejection of all relations is indeed the final aim of Mayavadin. And in the ascetic yoga, an entire loss of all relations of friendship and affection and attachment to the world and its living beings would be regarded as a promising sign of advance towards moksha. But even there, I think a feeling of oneness and unattached spiritual sympathy for all is at least a penultimate stage. like the compassion of the Buddhist before turning to moksha or nirvana. The conversation then turned back to my grand passion, grande passion, music. As we all know, he is a great musician. So he wanted to now ultimately ask about music. Should he sacrifice, give up his music? To put it in a nutshell, I felt that I was ready to renounce everything for yoga except my music. He smiled and said that in his yoga the surrender must be unconditional. In other words, if I were asked to give up music, I must be ready to jettison it at once. He added, Aurobindo, he added, the truth of the matter is this: so long as the joys which belong to the lower planes continue to be too vividly real and covetable, you will find ready enough reasons why you shouldn't decline them. And such beautiful clear. So long as the joys which belong to the lower planes continue to be vividly real and covetable, you will find ready enough reasons. You see, I'm a great musician, I'm a great philosopher, my father was a musician, so it's come in my genes. You'll have all the reasons in the world to continue to do what you're doing. So he says, you'll find ready enough reasons why you shouldn't decline them. You can forego them only when you have had the call of the higher joys, when the lower ones begin to pall, sound hollow. The promised land of the spirit begins from the frontier of worldly enjoyments to start with. A prophetic sentence, you can write it on the board. The promised land, P capital, L capital. The promised land of the spirit begins from the frontier of worldly enjoyments to start with. That means when all the worldly enjoyments are left behind, there begins the frontier of the promised land. But why is it, I asked after a pause, that one can't expect to have a glimpse before of this land because of the thick walls of our worldly desires? Your premise is not quite correct, he objected. I mean, if you are intellectual, Aurobindo giving intellectual answers. To a devotee, Champaklal is give a different way. But you see, the beautiful, and in Hindi we see that takkar, Aurobindo could take takkar, means he could really face anybody. And intellectual clarity. Your premise is not quite correct. For even when we live in the world of these desires, the glimpse, the call comes to us through chinks and rifts of dissatisfaction and surfeit. Only, it doesn't last long until you are somewhat purified, for then only do you really begin to be open to it. The darkness returns intermittently after the light, because it takes a long time to get our whole being open to the light. That's why yoga pushes us urgently upward to altitudes where the light can be shut out no more by clouds. And it is just because yoga is such an ascent of consciousness that any attachment to or desire for lures and laurels on the lower planes, material, intellectual or aesthetics, must eventually prove a shackle. Why then do you write so appreciatively of materialism as also of the intellectual and aesthetic delights? He says, Dilip is not going to give in so easily. He says, why then do you write so appreciatively of materialism as also of the intellectual and aesthetic delights? And why are your own writings so illuminating intellectually? Why have you praised art? Why write that the highest aim of the aesthetic being is to find the divine through beauty? Marvelous questions. I mean, he has done his homework well. Aurobindo says, why not? Intellect, art, poetry, knowledge of matter, etc. can all help our progress appreciably, provided you direct them properly. It is at bottom a case of evolution. That's why I once wrote, reason is the helper, reason is the bar. This is Aurobindo quoting himself. It's interesting. Which means simply that our intellect can be a help in our evolution only a part of the way. But when it presumes to judge what is beyond its domain, it must be put in its place. Besides, different recipients are differently constituted for different disciplines, seeking different fulfillments, each approaching truth in Swabhava. In other words, those who are best recipients for the light of the intellect are mentally more evolved than those who are not so gifted intellectually. But it doesn't mean that there are no realizations higher than the mental ones. Assuredly there are, as we can concretely verify as we open ourselves to the realizations of the Spirit. When we find mental joys no longer inadequate, aesthetic joys no longer satisfying, with this opening we glimpse worlds higher than those we have been used to. Do you follow? I mean, I'm seeing Sri Aurobindo, for the first time talking at length, because we have seen Sri Aurobindo writing long letters to Dilip Kumar or to Nirod Baran or to this. But here is a conversationalist, you see how clear is his explanation. This is, do you follow? Do you mean that yoga enlarges our consciousness more and more? That is my view of evolution, he nodded. This gradual unfolding of the consciousness ascending to its higher reaches. It is yoga which is to bring down further light and power in the next step of the evolution of human consciousness. I reverted to my difficulty. But what about my taking to yoga? The conversation is too gone. Says, hey, let's come back. He says, what about my taking to yoga? Everyone can practice some yoga or other suited to his nature. He replied non-committally. But my question was about your integral yoga of self-surrender. He said slowly as though weighing his words. About that, I cannot pronounce here and now. But why? Because the yoga that I have been pursuing of late, that's what I was referring to. Because the yoga that I have been pursuing of late, whose aim is the entire and radical transformation of the stuff and fabric of our consciousness and being, including our physical nature, is a very arduous one, fraught with grave perils at every step. In fact, so great are these dangers that I would not advise anybody to run them unless his call is so urgent that he is prepared to stake everything. Stake everything. In other words, I can accept only those with whom yoga has become such a necessity that nothing else seems worthwhile. In other words, I can accept only those with whom yoga has become such a necessity that nothing else seems worthwhile. In your case, it hasn't yet become so urgent. Your seeking is for some sort of partial elucidation of life's mysteries. This is at best an intellectual seeking, not an urgent need of the central being. Now look at this master, he can gauge, he can scan this person. He says, in your case, that this is at best an intellectual seeking, not an urgent need of the central being. Allow me to explain a little further, I said with a keen sense of disappointment. For I'm afraid you haven't quite seen where the shoe pinches. Dilip telling, I can assure you that mine is not merely an intellectual curiosity. Sri Aurobindo said, I said seeking, not curiosity. Really marvelous, because Sri Aurobindo says, this is at best an intellectual seeking. And Dilip Kumar Roy says, no, mine is not assets, it says, it's not a mental curiosity. But Sri Aurobindo says, I never said seeking, I never said curiosity, I said seeking. Difference between seeking and curiosity. I said seeking, not curiosity, he amended. And I referred to the present only. I did not mean this could not develop later on into a real need of your central being. I'm purposely sharing all this because we have a lot to learn. Is it a mental curiosity, an intellectual seeking of yoga, an emotional seeking, or is it a decision, D capital, of the central being? See, thrice he mentions the urgent need of the central being, a real need of your central being. And then he says, let me make it more explicit all the same, I insisted. I then gave him a fairly long recital of my woes and doubts, at first personal, but concluding with the widespread misery and fears of humanity. Sri Aurobindo, I quite see your difficulty, he said softly. For I too, look at this personal touch, for I too wanted at one time to transform through my yoga the face of the world. My aim was to change the fundamental nature and movements of humanity, to banish all the evils which afflict helpless mortality. See, we are getting such a glimpse into Sri Aurobindo's personal...
Highly disappointing now.
Pardon?
Highly disappointing because we were all thinking we are pretty into yoga.
That is the veil I wanted to remove. That we are all in this illusion, we are doing yoga and mother's yoga, integral yoga. Friends, see what it means. I too wanted to, my aim was to change the fundamental nature and movements of humanity, to banish all the evils which afflict helpless mortality. I felt a heave within, in my very blood, for one like him to talk so intimately to a stranger. Gratitude surged within me, and I hung on his words, eager to imbibe the sweet cadences of his serene voice. It was with this aspiration that I turned to yoga in the beginning, he added, Sri Aurobindo. And I came to Pondicherry because I had been directed by the voice, can you remember, to pursue my yoga here, V capital. I mean, because I had been directed by the voice, V capital, later he says it was the voice of Sri Krishna himself, to pursue my yoga here. It has nothing to do with any other political calculations that many people, some authors think of. Why did Sri Aurobindo come to Pondicherry? Not because of political refuge. Because I have been directed by the voice to pursue my yoga here. I read in the famous letters you wrote to your wife that you had turned to yoga to save our country. You see, Dilip Kumar read all the letters also. That's right. I told Lele when agreeing to follow his instructions that I would do his yoga only on condition that it didn't interfere with my poetry and service to the country. And then Lele agreed and gave me initiation. But soon afterward, he left, bidding me turn solely to my inner guidance. Since then, he went on, I have followed only this inner voice which has led me to develop what I named the integral yoga. It was then that my outlook changed with the knowledge born of my new yogic consciousness. I found to my utter disillusionment that it was only my ignorance which had led me to believe that the impossible was feasible here and now. Ignorance? He nodded. Because I didn't realize then that in order to help humanity out, it was not enough for an individual, however great, to achieve an ultimate solution individually. Humanity has to write for it too. For the crux of the difficulty is that even when the light is ready to descend, it cannot come to stay until the lower plane is ready to bear the pressure of the descent. You see, these are so clear now why he did what he did, the great tapasya, from 1924 to 1950. So he was trying to prepare the lower plane to bear the pressure of the descent. Consequently, he went on, the utmost you can do here and now is to communicate only partially the light of your realization in the measure that people are receptive. Even this is not very easy, mind you, for the fact of your having received something does not necessarily make you capable of making a free gift of it to others. You see, capacity to receive is one kind of aptitude, capacity to give quite another. Indeed, the latter is a very special kind of gift. Some there are who can only imbibe but not communicate. Because for one thing, what you communicate, everybody cannot receive, even when they earnestly want to. To sum up, the number of those is very limited who are capable of both giving and receiving. So you can understand the problem is by no means a simple one. What is one to do? Everybody does not want bliss or enlightenment. Men are at different stages of development, and this makes any universal panacea for life's evils an impossibility, as the history of human experience has proved again and again. But what about the widespread misery and fear and suffering? I said after a pause. How can you help that so long as men choose, as they do, to hug ignorance, which is at the root of all suffering? As long as they cherish the darkness of attachment rather than the light of liberation and knowledge, how can they expect to see? How would you evade the inexorable law of karma? What then are you striving for through your yoga? I insisted. For your own liberation or fulfillment? No, he said. That wouldn't have taken so long. But it's not possible to answer you more convincingly just now. For if I were to tell you why I am doing yoga, you would either not understand or misunderstand. Suffice it to say that I want to invoke here on earth the light of a higher world, to manifest a new power which will continue to exist as a new influence in the physical world and will be a direct manifestation of the divine in our entire being and life, being and daily life. Is this what you named the supramental divine? That's right. That's what I referred to when I was reading Savitri. Even in 1924 he says, I am pursuing that. That's right. Though the name is immaterial, what matters is to remember that for a variety of reasons, the direct action of the supramental has never yet been brought to bear on our earth nature and consciousness. Because the time was not favorable for such a descent? Partly. But there were other reasons also which I can't go into, as they cannot be communicated through mental language, and so if attempted, may only lead to fresh mystification. But tell me at least if the yogis of yore knew of this power. This is an important question. And I'm really amazed at Dilip Kumar. You see, the number of questions is frankly asking Sri Aurobindo. He must be a great intellect, Otherwise you'll flounder in front of Sri Aurobindo asking him questions. But tell me at least if the yogis of the yore knew of this power, the supramental power. Some did. That's very interesting. Just some did. But how can I put the truth of the matter to you? What happened was that they used to rise individually to this plane and stay there in union. They didn't bring it down to act upon our terrestrial consciousness. Perhaps they did not even attempt to. But I would rather not tell you more about this, because as I said, the mind cannot even glimpse the supramental truth, to say nothing of understanding it. But on whom and what will the supramental work? I asked. Why? On our life material, of course, down to matter and the physical. Didn't the ancient yogis attempt this either? Well, I'll take another 5 minutes. I'll not delay for that. Not with the supramental instrumentation. Their preoccupation was not so much with our basic material physical, because to transform it with a spiritual force is the most difficult of all achievements. But that's precisely why it must be achieved. But does the divine seriously want such a tremendous thing to be achieved? Tell you the daredevil. But the divine seriously wants such a tremendous thing to be achieved, that transformation is the divine thing? As to whether the divine seriously means something to happen, I believe it is intended. I know with absolute certitude that the supramental is a truth, and that its advent is in the nature of things inevitable. The question is as to the when and the how. That also is decided and predestined from somewhere above. But it is here being fought out amid rather a grim clash of conflicting forces. Forgive me, I didn't quite follow this. I know, he intervened, for it is somewhat abstruse. It is like this. In the terrestrial world, the predetermined result is hidden. And what we see is a whirl of possibilities and forces attempting to achieve something with the destiny of it all concealed from human eyes. This is, however, certain, that a number of souls have been sent to see that it shall be achieved here and now. That is the situation. That's where I called them the apostles. You didn't agree with that. Please be a little more explicit. To say more would be going beyond the line. But tell me at least when the miracle will happen. He will not leave Aurobindo easy. You don't want me to start prophesying. As a rationalist, you can't. He's catching him. As a rationalist, you can't. But tell me one thing. Didn't any of your predecessors make this attempt? I mean, what you call the integral transformation of the physical consciousness? The attempt might have been made. It's not certain. But what is certain is that nothing decisive was achieved on the physical plane. How do you infer that? He's saying, how do you infer that? Because all achievements leave some legacy of traces for posterity to follow. A spiritual realization once completely achieved could never be wholly obliterated afterward. You must then realize it yourself first? Obviously. Be it a new realization or light or idea, it must first descend into one person from whom it radiates out in widening circles to others. Doesn't the Gita too say that the ways of the best men act as models to the rest? In the integral yoga, however, the work starts after the realization, whereas in most other yogas it ends with the realization. The reason is that I aim primarily at manifestation, for which I must obviously reach the supramental myself before I can bring it to bear on earth consciousness. For this ascent has to be the first step. Descent is the next. What I'm charmed by this conversation is the I. For the first time I hear Aurobindo talking in a personal thing. That I must do that. I aim manifestation to reach the supramental myself is souls. How will the descent work to start with? When the supramental touches our being, our consciousness will overpass its twilight stage of the mental, where the divine truth is distorted, into the upper regions where light has free play. That is where there are no such distortions. This will in turn bring about the transformation of the mind, life and body, as that will be one of the functions of the force such as inception in the world of matter, generally, to usher in subsequently the new era in man's living. You must not misunderstand me. What I want to achieve is the prophecy. What I want to achieve is the bringing down of the supramental to bear on this being of ours, so as to raise it to a higher level, to a level higher than the mental, and from there change and sublimate the workings of mind, life and body. But this is not to say that supramentalization will be effectuated overnight, so that all will be completely transformed. That's hardly feasible. Because we are not mature for such transformation. Not only that, there are other obstinate impediments and hostile forces to reckon with. The world of matter has been for ages the bulwark of darkness, falsehood's most redoubtable citadel, where hitherto inertia has reigned supreme. To carry there the message of truth, to make it responsive to the shock of light, is far from easy. Yet the supramental power can work its way if once it can descend there. That is to say, if once the earth consciousness can bear it to start with. I'm amazed at Sri Aurobindo's attempt. Suppose it does. On whom will the force be dynamic in its inception? On those who have acquired the power to be its medium or vehicle. Each of these will serve as an indicator of what humanity is potentially capable of becoming once it is transformed. Do you follow? After a fashion, I suppose. But tell me please, if this power or influence will benefit many or only a handful of isolated here and there? I think we should all learn this, because many of us think it's a property of ashram also, or Aurobindo, the supermind. Many certainly. My integral yoga would be of little use if it were meant for one or two individuals. For you must remember that my object is not the abandonment of the physical material life to drift by itself, but the fundamental transformation of it by the power of this higher light and reasoning and seeing. But I hope your followers and successors won't have to emulate you in your superhuman sadhana if they are to arrive. This is another question, and a very important one. Deepshika, you look into that. But I hope your followers and successors won't have to emulate you in your superhuman sadhana if they are to arrive. No. Sri Aurobindo smiled. And that was what I really meant when I said a little while ago that my yoga was meant for humanity. The first that hews his way through a trackless jungle acts necessarily as the pathfinder, clearing the way for his followers. He faces much to make it easier for his successors. I was reminded of a saying of the great yogi Sri Ramakrishna. The man who makes a fire has to take a lot of trouble, but once lit, all who come near may safely reap the benefit of its warmth. As I pondered the significance of this simile, a deep sense of reverence pervaded my being. I wondered how few of us even imagined that such a man was living in our midst. But then, hasn't it always been so from time immemorial? How many truly appraised the greatness of Sri Ramakrishna during his lifetime? I felt suddenly a strong impulse to make Sri Aurobindo my obeisance once more. I restrained myself with effort. His gaze was on me unwaveringly. Suddenly I felt curious upsurge of skepticism, so utterly out of tune with my nascent adoration. But are you convinced it will be possible? Really feasible? For a single individual, I have seen it is possible. For I have seen the working of this tremendous victorious force, annihilating at a sweep the forces of darkness and inertia which conspire to keep the spirit under the thrall of matter and flesh. To give a concrete instance, a yogi could be here and now, achieve complete immunity from the forces of disease if he could isolate himself completely from his surroundings. But why does he fail when he reverts to the world? Because of the universal suggestion of disease when it comes of this seclusion. Because of the universal suggestion of disease when he comes out of his seclusion. My skepticism took yet another line. But do you think this to be such a great achievement? After all, seeing that even the great Buddha attached so little importance to the physical aspect of our suffering? You forget, Buddha had a different outlook of life, a different object. He wanted through nirvana a final exit from this phenomenal world of the senses. It may be that at that stage of our human evolution, man was not mature enough for a greater realization. But whatever the reason, you cannot get away from the fact that Buddha wanted fulfillment by turning away from all play of expression, which is life's mode of self-manifestation. Whereas I want is transformation, complete transformation. My aim is not to disown life, but to transmute it through the alchemy of the light of the Spirit. For some time I did not know what to say next. Then a sort of curiosity, or shall I say eagerness, got the better of me in spite of my misgivings. But what about my yoga? The last question. But what about my yoga? I brought myself to say apropos of nothing. The next moment I felt a strange questioning. Was I really calling for an answer? I could not quite decide. His glance cut into me like a knife. Yours is still a mental seeking, he said. For my yoga, something more is needed. Why not wait till the time comes? When it does, may I count on your help? I asked anxiously. He gave an affirmative nod and smiled. And to this man, subsequently, Aurobindo wrote 6,000 pages of letters. You can imagine what is the substance. A man who can take 1 hour on the first meeting with Aurobindo and such great questions, he had many more. And he had 6,000 letters. And I was happy to see that Toby and Tine had the collection of Aurobindo's letters to Dilip Kumar Roy. I think Savitri, Bhavan ought to have these copies if you don't have. Marvelous, extraordinary. Well, friends, it was a little late, but I couldn't resist, because for the first time I heard Aurobindo speaking about himself, not writing. Writing we have read Synthesis of Yoga and all that. But I was so thrilled when I read that, I said I should share with you. Sorry for the delay, but this is what it is. Let's have the concentration.